everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm showing you how I drew this dog portrait, and I'll also be sharing with you some tips and tricks on how to make your drawings more realistic. As always, I start with some grid lines and a line drawing. I also put some light shading in to mark where the darker values are. I like to do quite detailed line drawings, but I find that if I just use line, I get caught up in the detail, and when I go back to do the shading, it becomes very difficult, almost like a maze, which made sense at the time, but now I almost have to retrace my steps to work it out. Once the line drawing is done and the base shadows are marked in, I like to erase the grid lines. But you need to be careful when you're erasing the grid lines. This can be a little bit of a balancing act because you need to do it at the right time. If you know that you won't need the grid lines again, like in the top of this drawing, you can erase those straight away. But sometimes, if there's lots of detail in your drawing, you may want to retain them so that you can double check reference points and remeasure when you're putting down your initial layers of shading. In this case, if you want to lighten the lines, you can use a kneaded eraser and roll it over the top quite gently. You want to make sure that your reference points and grid lines are sufficiently erased before you start into shading, because once your first layer of detailed shading goes in, it can be quite difficult to erase. For me, the initial layers of shading are the time when I start to relax into the more enjoyable part of the drawing. When the line drawing is down and I know my proportions are there or thereabouts correct, and my base shadows are marked in, so it's easier for me to see how the drawing is going to progress. At this stage, I can see lots of work that needs to be done, but I can choose where I want to start and what areas to work on. Sometimes I like to add layers to the whole drawing to build up the tones layer by layer. Other times I'll work into an area almost to completion before moving on to another area. And it all just depends on the drawing and what I'm doing and how I feel about the section I'm completing. Where you want to start and how you want to progress is down to personal preferences. Some artists like to start at the top and work down, completing each section methodically as they go. Others like to work from left to right or right to left if they're left-handed, so that they avoid using their hand to smudge any of their drawing. For me though, I like to take a fluid approach and be flexible in terms of how I progress each drawing. Regardless of how you choose to progress, the techniques will be the same. For example, if you're working section by section, you will then do each step for each section: shading, blending, and detail work. If you're working on the drawing as a whole, you complete each step as you go along. So at an early stage, I like to blend out the edges. Unless you're drawing a mechanical object with a sharp edge, a softer edge will give you a more realistic finish. Even if you've many layers left to put in, softening the edges now can really help. In my process, at some stage, invariably, I hit what I call the ugly stage. Now, if you already know what I'm talking about, give me a thumbs up, and if not, let me explain. It normally happens in the middle or towards the end of the drawing, and it's characterised by feelings of panic, regret, general self-doubt. The drawing got off to a good start with a solid effort on the line drawing, but somewhere in the layers of shading you lost some of the details you intended to capture, and the tonal values of the shading are still a little bit flat and lacking a real 3D effect. And it's at this point you wonder if you've ruined your drawing and should quit, or you should keep the faith a while longer and trust the process. But I find that when I'm in doubt, if I check the proportions and shading are correct proportionally speaking, turn the drawing upside down, and look for mismatches, or flip it to the inverse with a photo to get a fresh perspective. Compare it to the reference photo, and if all looks good, then you just have to trust the process and power on. Sometimes I find that working into an area in detail can renew the faith, and once you start to see your progress again, you're on the home straight. The final phase is putting in the fine details, and the question here is, how far do you go? When I started drawing first, I called my drawings finished too soon. I had spent so long at it and I just wanted it to be finished. But now, when I look back, I think if I had just spent another hour or two at it, I could have made a real improvement and made it much more realistic. So what can you do? Texture is really important. And it's not always about using your pencils to create the texture. Sometimes your eraser can do great work in this area, especially if you're doing things like fur. The second thing is increasing the contrast. Towards the end of the drawing, if your reference is stuck in midtones, exaggerate the contrast slightly to make your drawing pop. The third thing I would recommend is adding a few small highlights. These will make a big difference if they're used sparingly. For example, in this drawing here, I've used a white pen for the dot and the eye. You could also use a white paint and a tiny paintbrush for more realistic, subtle finish. Well, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, you might also like how to draw from a reference photo, or tips for choosing good reference photos. As always, thanks for watching and see you soon.